the Minuet according to Johann Sebastian Bach. In this video, we'll learn how the Master of Masters approached the composition of one of the most iconic dances of his time. In the first part, we'll discuss the general stylistic principles of the Minuet in the beginning of the 18th century. In the second part, we'll dig into Bach's specific compositional procedures, from the tonal plan to the formal layout and the thematic treatment. And finally, in the third part, I'll illustrate how to incorporate these techniques in an original composition, so you can apply them too in your own masterworks. Let's begin. The Minuet, Minuet in French or Menuetto in Italian, was a French social dance originated in the 17th century. During Bach's lifetime, in the first half of the 18th century, the Minuet had successfully spread across Europe, and it was regarded as a modern and fashionable dance, just like the bourrée, the gavotte, and the passe-pied, among others. This group of dances is often referred to as galanterie, which means gallant, a term used by Bach himself in the front page of his keyboard partitas. In the late Baroque suite, galanterie were usually inserted here, between the slow sarabande and the fast final gig. However, the general scheme of the suite was flexible and varied greatly from one piece to another. It's worth noting that more often than not, galanterie appeared in contrasting pairs, but that's something we'll talk about later in this video. Among the galanterie dances, the Minuet was considered the most sophisticated one. It wasn't hard to dance, but it was hard to dance it right. The music was in triple time, usually written in 3/4, although other time signatures such as 3/8 or even 6/4 were occasionally employed too. Its character, according to the historical sources, was of moderate cheerfulness, in contrast to the frivolous mood of the passe-pied or the skipping nature of the gavotte. However, the exact tempo of the Minuet seems to have been quite flexible, depending on the period, the geographical region, and the composer's preferences, but always within the span of moderate tempos. According to Johann Mattheson, contemporary of Johann Sebastian Bach, the Minuet could be meant for dancing, singing, or playing. In the first group, we've got the Minuets composed for the ballroom, which could appear as autonomous works. For obvious reasons, they required a perfect understanding of the dance step patterns by the composer. Only on special occasions would the composer and the dance master work together to create staged minuets with unique choreographies. For the most part, regular minuets, also known as Minuet ordinaire, would work on the basis of standardized 4 plans or figures, as we shall see later. The second group, the singing minuets, refers, according to Mattheson, to vocal pieces in tempo di minuetto. They don't necessarily follow the formal conventions of the dance, and sometimes they aren't even true minuets at all. By extension, we could also apply this category to instrumental pieces that use this indication. And finally, the minuets meant for playing, which Mattheson roughly described as those that aren't suitable for singing nor dancing. Most, if not all, of Johann Sebastian Bach's minuets fall into this category, but that doesn't mean they aren't closely related to their ballroom counterparts. In fact, many of them are actually danceable. As we shall see, even if a given minuet wasn't meant for the ballroom, the composers still followed the same basic principles with regard to the form and rhythmic patterns. The basic step unit of the Minuet was the pas de Minuet, which consisted of 6 beats distributed across 2 music measures. For the dancers, the Minuet was felt more like in 6/4 than in 3/4, which has formal implications that I'll explain later. There were at least 4 variants of the pas de Minuet, but the most common one in Bach's time was the pas de Minuet en floret, which we can see here. There are 2 key characteristics of this variant. First, the anacroustic character, that is, how every upbeat is always accompanied by this same gesture. Second, the pas de Minuet en floret had a characteristic rest between beats 1 and 3. This gesture was very important and considered one of its key stylistic features. If we were to translate this into rhythmic notation, it would look something like this. Notice that I didn't include the initial upbeat, because in Bach's time it was usually omitted. With respect to the first bar, there is no need to keep a literal musical rest on the second beat, as long as the first beat feels stressed enough, which can be achieved by different procedures such as prolonging the first note or executing it as an appoggiatura. On the other hand, the rhythmic distribution of the second bar remains unclear in the historical treatises. What you see here is one possible solution. Let's hear it. The correlation between the music and the dance steps wasn't always as obvious as in the previous example. However, even in more ornamented melodies, it's usually possible to keep track of some underlying rhythmic scheme. Composers weren't obliged to musically underline every step of the dance. On the contrary, challenging the underlying rhythmic scheme was also expected from time to time as a way to spice things up. That's the case of hemiolas, which is the 3:2 rhythmic ratio. In this example by Bach, we can appreciate how the second beat on bars 1 and 2 is harmonically stressed, giving the temporary impression of a downbeat. The regular triple meter only becomes evident after the last beat of the second bar. Hemiolas weren't exclusive of the minuet, and they frequently appear too in other triple-meter dances such as the passe-pied, fulfilling the very same role. Now let's talk about the minuet's structure. The minuet was built around a series of rotational sections, in which the dancers performed dance floor patterns or figures. The average length for a minuet figure, according to the historical sources, was of 8 music bars, or, from the dancer's point of view, 4 pas de minuet. Shorter or longer figures of 10, 12 or more bars were also acceptable, as long as the total number of bars was even, to make sure the last pas de minuet could be performed complete. The regular ballroom minuet consisted of 6 figures, so if the average length per figure was 8 bars, the total number of bars per minuet would usually be around 48 bars. This may seem like a lot of music, but there is another way to express these numbers, taking into account the repetitions. This here is the aspect of the regular minuet in the first half of the 18th century. There are 2 things worth noting. First, the music is clearly divided through the repetition signs in 2 parts, which is why most authors and textbooks call this a binary form. However, that's not the whole story, because what we do here below are usually 3 distinctive thematic passages or subsections, the last 2 grouped together. Some authors call them rotations. There are, of course, variants of this scheme, but they will be addressed later in this video. The second thing to note down is that music and dance didn't have a fixed relation. As I explained before, the minuet had a total of 6 figures, but we only have 3 music rotations. If we do the maths, this means that at some point different figures will be danced to the very same music. For the professor Eric McKee, this wasn't really a problem, because the main role of the music wasn't to provide a concrete melodic material for each figure, but to ensure that the hypermeter of 2 bar units was clearly audible for the dancers throughout the piece. As I stated before, minuets usually appeared in pairs. This practice would be kept until the end of the century, with the second minuet normally referred to as trio. However, this name was only used occasionally during Bach's time. The relation between both minuets was flexible and variable, but as a rule of thumb, some sort of contrast and some degree of motivic correlation was normally expected. Once the second minuet was finished, it was customary to play the first minuet again, optionally without inner repetitions. This practice was known as Minuet 1 da capo, which means from the top. And that's all I have to say for now about the Baroque minuet. Johann Sebastian Bach composed at least 38 minuets, or 40 if we take into account the first 2 minuets from the notebook for Wilhelm Friedemann Bach. Many scholars today think that these works were actually composed by Bach's son, Wilhelm Friedemann, with or without the help of his father. The third minuet of the set has also raised doubts with regard to its authorship, but for now I'll include it in the main list. Other works that I excluded from the list are the Tempo di Minuetto from Bach's Keyboard Partita No. 5, which I don't think it's an actual minuet, and of course the minuets from the notebook for Anna Magdalena Bach, formerly attributed to Johann Sebastian. At least 2 of them, yes, those, were actually composed by the German organist Christian Petzold. The authorship of the rest, however, remains unclear. Bach's minuets come from a wide variety of contexts, but none of them were intended for the ballroom. As you can see here, most of them were composed for the keyboard, but there are also minuets for other instruments and a few orchestral works. This is relevant because the context usually influences the style. In 15 of the cases, the minuets were meant to be grouped in pairs, which represents more than 68% of the total. This confirms the expectation that grouping was usual but not mandatory. one curious exception, the keyboard suite in G minor, which has 3 minuets grouped together. I distinguish 3 main styles within Bach's minuets: the cantabile, the moto perpetuo, and the danceable minuet. Keep in mind that these are enclosed categories and that many pieces present features from more than one style at the same time. The cantabile minuets are characterized by their expressive nature and their long and sustained melodic lines that proceed mostly by stepwise motion. In keyboard minuets, the cantabile style usually implies a prominent use of counter melodies in contrapuntal fashion. The cantabile style was regarded as sophisticated, and Bach usually reserves it for introspective moments, often in the second minuets. The moto perpetuo style is restricted to keyboard pieces, and it emulates the characteristic continuous flow of the Baroque preludes, with short repeating motifs and recurrent harmonic sequences. And finally, the danceable minuets are characterized by their simplicity, uncomplicated harmonies, and a strong focus on the 2 bars hypermeter. Danceable minuets for keyboard are usually written in only 2 parts and have a less pronounced contrapuntal character. They represent the modern versus the old practice in Bach, an anticipation of the mid-18th century galant style. The majority of Bach's minuets are in major mode, with a 3:1 ratio with respect to the minor mode. The preferred keys for the major mode are C, G, D, E, F, B flat, and E flat. On the other hand, the most repeated keys for the minor mode are A minor, B minor, D minor, G minor, and C minor. In general, Bach's minuets don't stray too far away from C major in the circle of fifths, except from one notorious exception, the second minuet from the keyboard suite in E flat major, which is in E flat minor. When 2 minuets are grouped together and the first one is in major mode, the preferred choice by far is to keep the same key and mode in the second minuet. The second most usual choice is moving to the 6th degree, the relative minor, for instance from C major to A minor. And the third option is the parallel minor, same tonic but different mode, for instance from G major to G minor. Now, if the first paired minuet is in minor mode, there seems to be more options for the second minuet's key without a clear preference. Staying in the same key and mode, moving to the 3rd degree, the relative major, for instance from G minor to B flat major, going to the 4th degree, for instance from B minor to E minor, or switching to the parallel major. Let's talk about form. The standard formal layout in Bach's minuets is the triple rotation model with a distribution of 8 plus 16 bars on each reprise, or in other words, 8 bars per rotation, not counting repetitions. This model appears in 16 of Bach's minuets, which represents around 42% of the total. This makes perfect sense according to what I already explained about the minuets principles in the first half of the video. From time to time, we'll encounter variations on this scheme, in which the second part is shortened down to 12 bars, or extended up to 20, 22, 24, or even 26, always an even number of bars for the reasons I explained earlier. In these cases, the distribution of bars between the second and third rotation is variable and changes from one piece to another. The presence of 4 real rotations is extremely uncommon, although Bach used this option in the first minuet of his orchestral suite number 4. Variations in which the first rotation is doubled up to 16 bars are also possible, with different combinations of length for the second part. Minuets with only 2 true rotations are rather uncommon in Bach. One example is the minuet from the first version of the French suite number 4. By far, the most peculiar minuet with regard to the formal structure is the one from the Brandenburg Concerto number 1. It's not just that it has only 2 rotations, the number of bars per part is also uncommon, although their total sum, counting repetitions, is the normative 48. The thing is, the whole second rotation is a literal transposition of the first one, a procedure that Bach will never repeat again in his Minuets, and not to mention the particular tonal plan of this piece, but we'll get into that later. This Minuet is quite an early work, as it was recycled from Bach's Sinfonia in F major from 1718, so some of its features may reflect procedures that Bach stopped using in later years. Let's talk about the tonal plan. Bach's minuets are built around 2 main key areas distributed in 3 rotations. The first and third rotation must begin and end in the main key. The first rotation may or may not end in the main key, and the third rotation may or may not begin already in the main key. The same applies to the second rotation, which may or may not begin in the secondary key, but will always end in it. As you can see, this leaves room for a lot more tonal areas than the scheme may initially suggest. Minuets where the third rotation ends in a different key than the beginning are extremely uncommon and appear only in second minuets or in multi-movement works where there is going to be more music after, such as the case with the Minuet from the Brandenburg Concerto No. 1. The concrete tonal procedures used by Bach are as follows. If the main key is in major mode, the first rotation either 1. Stays in the initial key and finishes with a perfect authentic cadence, 2. Stays in the initial key and finishes with a half cadence, or 3. Modulates to the dominant key and finishes with a perfect authentic cadence. The last 2 options are the standard in Bach, while the first one is less used and it mostly appears in early works. For the options 2 and 3, the opening key of the second rotation may be the first or the fifth degree of the initial key, and in either way, the secondary key will usually be the 6th degree or the 2nd degree, both in minor mode. The second rotation always finishes with a perfect authentic cadence, and the same goes for the third rotation once the main key has been regained. In the first option, only used occasionally by Bach, the second rotation may begin on the 1st, 5th or 6th degree, and the secondary key will be the 5th degree in most cases. When the main key is in minor mode, we've got the following options for the first rotation. First, staying in the initial key and ending with a half cadence. Second, moving to the dominant, sometimes the minor dominant, and ending with a perfect authentic cadence. And third, modulating to the 3rd degree, the relative major, and ending with a perfect authentic cadence. All of them are equally common. For the first 2 options, the second rotation will usually begin either in the 1st or 5th degree of the initial key, just like in major mode. In these cases, the secondary key is usually the 3rd degree. However, the 5th degree might occasionally be found too. For the last option, it's common that the second rotation begins directly in the 3rd degree key, but then the secondary key will be a different one, normally the 4th degree or even the minor 5th. Keep in mind that these schemes are just guidelines based on the most usual procedures and not absolute rules. Not all of Bach's minuets conform to them always. Now let's see how rotations are built. Most of themes in Bach's minuets fall into one of these 3 categories: periods, sentences, and hybrids, which display characteristics from both. The first one is by large the most common. The period is, so to speak, the question and answer type of theme. In the period, we've got an initial 2 bars long basic idea, followed by a cadential passage that leads to a weak cadence on the first beat of bar 4, normally a half cadence. This first part is known as antecedent. In the second part, the initial basic idea appears again, literal, varied or transposed, although still recognizable, and another cadential passage, which might be a repetition of the previous one or completely new, leads the music to a final strong cadence, normally a perfect authentic cadence. This is known as consequent. The difference of strength between the first and second cadence is one of the crucial aspects of the period. This holds true even if the consequent modulates to a different key, which is the modulating period variant. An excellent example of period is the second minuet from Bach's French Suite No. 2. Here we've got an initial 2 bars long basic idea, a cadential passage leading to a half cadence, a repetition of the initial basic idea but now in a modulating fashion, and a final strong cadence in the new key, G minor. Sometimes the order of the cadences is reversed. James Webster called this anti-period. In the sentence, there is no middle cadence. Just like in the period, we've got an initial 2 bars long basic idea, but then this idea will be repeated next, literal, varied, or transposed sequentially. This first part is known as presentation. After the presentation, we've got an elaborative passage known as continuation that brings the music to a close with either a half cadence or a perfect authentic cadence. The behavior of the continuation is variable, but it's usually based on motivic fragmentation, sequential activity, and an increase of the harmonic rhythm. The sentence is, in many aspects, a modern and simplified version of the Minuet, the paradigmatic sequential structure from the Baroque period. Just like in periods, sentences can modulate and finish in a different key. In Bach's Minuets, sentences are more likely to be found in second and third rotations. In the following example from Bach's French Suite No. 4, we can easily appreciate the sequential repetition of the initial basic idea, followed by a continuation to the final cadence. In threefold sentences, the continuation opens with a sequential repetition of the basic idea, so it sounds 3 times in total. The most common type of hybrid theme in Bach is the one that starts off like a period, but then the second part opens with a new material and behaves more like a continuation. This is a clear example from Bach's Orchestral Suite No. 2. We've got a regular antecedent ending with a weak cadence, and then a normative continuation to a cadence. In the compound period, we've got 2 themes that start with the same basic idea. The first one ends with a weak cadence, and the second one with a strong cadence like in a regular period. In the following example, Bach links 2 sentences together to form a compound period. Notice how the presentations are identical in both cases. The thematic interrelation between rotations is highly variable, and almost every minuet by Bach does something different. If we focus on the relation between 2 rotations, we've got the following possibilities. First, the simple binary option, in which the second rotation is essentially a completely different theme with respect to the first one. The second option is what some authors call the balanced binary form, in which the beginning of the second rotation is a varied or transposed quote of the beginning of the first rotation. This is a very common strategy in Bach's minuets, but the correlation between rotations usually weakens halfway. As I mentioned before, there is only one of Bach's minuets in which the whole second rotation is a transposition of the first one. Then we've got the so-called rounded binary form, in which the second rotation quotes the last measures of the first one, but not the beginning. A variant of this principle that I call the long rounded binary form, and others may know as the small ternary, happens when the third rotation is a complete repetition of the first one after a contrasting middle rotation. As you may imagine, things get even more interesting when we add this third rotation into the equation, because everything I explained earlier applies not only to the relation between rotations 1 and 2, but to rotations 2 and 3, and rotations 1 and 3. So, the beginning of the first rotation might be quoted only in the second rotation, only in the third rotation, in both, or not at all. So yeah, that's a lot of different possible combinations. Welcome to Bach's Permutation Playground. In order to illustrate the principles explained up to this point, I'll use a minuet specifically composed for this video. Keep in mind that the purpose of this content is to divulgate the compositional procedures of Bach and encourage you to learn and use them as you see fit. I am not a professional composer, and if my musical perpetration offends someone's ears, I apologize in advance. My stylistic reference for this piece was Bach's first minuet from his French Suite No. 1, also in D minor. Something quite evident just by looking at the score is that I used two contrasting styles in the first theme, the cantabile for the first 3 bars, with stepwise melodic lines and a bit of contrapuntal treatment, and the moto perpetuo with a stable rhythmic accompaniment. This kind of dotted rhythms are usually associated to the French music, but also to the sarabande, the slow Spanish dance. Curiously enough, Bach doesn't usually employ them in his minuets, but they do appear in the ones from his French Suite No. 1, so I decided to include them too. I like to think of this as a minuet a la sarabande. The structure is a hybrid theme with a clear 4 bars antecedent that ends with a weak cadence, and a continuation that proceeds sequentially to the final half cadence. There is no modulation. The music stays in D minor until the end. The second rotation goes on with a moto perpetuo rhythmic flow. The anacroustic motifs are derived directly from the continuation of the first rotation, establishing a clear motivic correlation with the preceding material, and there is even a brief quote of the opening sarabande motif. The cadential material, however, is completely new. The structure, as you can see, is a normative 8 bars sentence. The theme establishes the new key of F major, which is the relative major of the initial key, one of the standard options for the second rotation, as I explained earlier in this video. After the cadence, a modulation to B flat major is hinted, but as we shall see next, we won't stay in it for long. The third and last rotation opens with a type of modulating sequence known as the Monte schema, in which the bass ascends by a stepwise motion. Rhythmically speaking, this is a hypermetric hemiola, in which we've got 2 parts of 3 bars each overlap to the regular 2 bars minuet hypermeter. This is probably not something you'd like to do in an actual danceable minuet, for the reasons I explained in the first part of this video, but luckily this is not one of those. Although it's not too obvious, the motivic content of this passage is also derived from the first rotation, just not the initial motif. The structure of this theme is, once more, a sentence. Notice how the cadential material is taken from the analog place in the second rotation, one of the possible variants of the rounded binary form. The brief coda that essentially repeats the previous cadential passage is a formal liberty on my side. Bach never used a coda like this in his minuets, but I thought the music could use a more conclusive ending. Let's see how this sounds like. That's all for today. If you like what I do, consider supporting me on Patreon. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.